We hear it mindlessly repeated time and time again that communism failed. Now, it's rarely actually thought about in detail. It's one of those buzz phrases people just throw out there. What exactly does it mean to fail? What does it mean to succeed? What's the actual empirical evidence? What did the people of these countries think? Well, these questions are really never considered because it's a lot easier just to accept the one-sentence buzzword of communism failed. Well, what exactly does it mean for an economy to succeed or to fail? I think the most rational concept of a system's success is providing the best economically possible conditions for the most amount of people. This is a proper way of thinking about an economy's success, as it takes into account the fact that all economic systems aren't at the same point of development. So many people like to compare the USSR to a nation like the United States, which is just a horrible comparison, as the United States had hundreds of years to industrialize and become a world superpower. They had a history of economic imperialism and colonial plunder, whereas the USSR only started to industrialize within the 30s, and they were coming out of an economically backwards status. Most of their economy was agricultural. Most people were peasants. You would not compare a marathon runner to someone who only jogs casually. You don't compare someone who is learning to cook to a master chef. You compare nations according to other nations with similar economic development, as well as where a nation is coming from, what their conditions are before the revolution, and what the revolution did to change those. One of the most important things to look for when it comes to an economy in general is the economic growth. This one economist gave this thought experiment about how necessary it is for an economy to grow. That is the question, would you rather live in 1910 as a rich man or as a middle-income person in modern times? Well, within 1910, you are going to have a severe lack of technology at your disposal, and a general lack of efficiency in regards to many ways of life. This is why I think many would answer they would rather have a modest, middle-income existence in modern times, and that stresses the importance of economic growth. And the economy within the Soviet Union did grow massively. Whether anyone realizes it or not, it's kind of self-evident when you really think about it. The Soviet Union went from being a largely backwards, illiterate, agrarian nation to rivaling the United States as a world superpower. Now, had socialism not worked, had it been a complete failure, the Cold War could have never have happened. The US wouldn't have taken any type of Soviet challenge to their authority seriously whatsoever. Had socialism never worked, the Soviet Union wouldn't have been able to organize a space race in which they put the first man-made satellite, man, woman, and animal into space. Now, funny enough, the same people that tell us that socialism didn't work were also afraid of the Soviets overtaking their economy, such as CIA Director Alan Dulles, who stated that if the Soviet industrial growth rate persists at 8 or 9% annum over the next decade, as is forecast, the gap between our two economies by 1970 will be dangerously narrowed unless our industrial growth rate is substantially increased from the present pace. When it comes to the USSR, it was the second fastest growing economy for its time. It raised the production levels of industry so fast it was nicknamed the Bolshevik tempo. And what is more impressive is that this happened when capitalist nations were struggling with the Great Depression and various recessions. While capitalist nations were struggling, the Soviet economy was getting off the ground just fine. To quote Steven Gowans in his fantastic article, in 1928, the Soviet Union was still largely an agrarian country, and most people worked in agriculture, compared to a minority in Western Europe and North America. Hence, the economy of the USSR, at the point of its transition to public ownership and planning, was very different from that of industrialized Western capitalist countries. On the other hand, the rest of the world resembled the Soviet Union in also being largely agrarian. It is, therefore, the rest of the world, not the United States and other advanced industrialized countries, with which the USSR should be compared. From 1928 to 1989, Soviet GDP per capita not only exceeded growth in rich countries, but exceeded growth in all other regions of the world combined to a greater degree. Hence, not only did the publicly owned planned economy of the Soviet Union outpace the economies of richer capitalist economies, it even grew faster than the economies of countries that were most like the USSR in 1928. For example, outside its southern core, Latin America's GDP per capita was $1,332, almost equal to the USSR's $1,370. By 1989, the Latin American figure had reached $4,886, but average income in the Soviet Union had climbed far higher, to $7,078. Public ownership and planning had raised the living standards to a higher level than capitalism had in Latin America, despite an equal starting point. Moreover, the Soviet peacetime economy unfailingly expanded. The Latin American economy grew in fits and starts, with enterprises regularly shutting their doors and laying off employees. And the improvement of living standards was most especially clear in Soviet Asia compared to the rest of Asia. It was bordering nations which it had an equal economic development with. And even Westerners, such as Jeffrey Jukes, have to admit that living standards did objectively improve. The Soviet Union, in the past 50 years, had conducted social experiments in raising the living standards of its Asian minorities, well above those of the neighbors, from whom they were virtually indistinguishable in 1917. The gist of the Soviet message is that a developing country can convert itself reasonably rapidly into a developed industrial one, precisely as the Soviet Union has done, with minimal dependence on Western capital, little or no abatement or political hostility to the West, without the introduction of a fully fledged capitalist system, and with commitment to advancement of education and social services. And the economist David Kotz, along with Fred Weir, say in their book The Revolution from Above, in 1917, the Russian economy lagged far behind the dynamic capitalism of the great powers. In 1980, some 60 years after the Russian Revolution, the Soviet Union was one pole of a bipolar world. It had been transformed into an urban, industrialized country of 265 million people. By such measurements as life expectancy, caloric intake, and literacy, the Soviet Union had reached the ranks of the developed countries. It gave economic and military aid to many countries around the world. It was a leader in many areas of science and technology. It launched the first space satellite, in some more prosaic fields, ranging from specialized metals, to machines for seamless welding of railroad tracks, to eye surgery equipment. It was a world leader. Its performing artists and athletes were among the world's best. With its Warsaw Pact allies, it was the military equal of the United States-led NATO alliance. And it's completely true. Caloric intake, for example, dramatically rose after collectivization of agriculture. People like to point to the problems of the 1930s famine, trying to blame it all on socialism, which is a mere correlation-causation fallacy. Yet they don't like to speak of what happened after the reorganization was completed, after collectivization was functioning fully without kulak opposition. Because of collectivization, the peasants were able to have a record-breaking harvest, which was able to properly feed the entire populace. Anna Louise Strong, who toured the Ukraine, Russia, all throughout the USSR states, from one end of the land to the other, there was shortage and hunger, and a general increase in mortality from this. But the hunger was distributed. Nowhere was there panic chaos that is implied by the word famine. The conquest of bread was achieved that summer, a victory snatched from a great disaster. The 1933 harvest surpassed that of 1930, which till then had held the record. This time the new record was made not by burst of half-organized enthusiasm, but by growing efficiency and permanent organization. Victory was consolidated the following year by the great fight the collective farmers made against a drought that affected all the southern half of Europe. In each area where winter wheat failed, scientists determined what second crops were best. These were publicized and the government shot in the seed by fast freight. This nationwide cooperation beat the 1934 drought, securing a total crop for the USSR equal to the all-time high of 1933. Even in the worst regions, most farmers came through with food for man and beast, with strengthened organization. Even up till the end, the Soviets held food security on par with the US. And that is coming from an official CIA report. It states that not only was calorie consumption on par with the US, the Soviet diet was actually healthier than America's. When it comes to literacy, there was massive literacy campaigns aimed at education of all, and they achieved near universal literacy.
We went from house to house in search of illiterate people. We made a note of their names. We then found suitable rooms to hold classes in.
Learning to write would open new doors for those trapped at the bottom of society. One woman who couldn't attend classes because of her child at home was helped by Anastasia Denisova.
Я сказала, что вот тебе учебник, вот будешь заниматься.
I said, here's a textbook for you. I'll come to you so you can learn to read at home. I remember vividly that when the baby cried, she carried on writing with one hand while she rocked him with the other. She was so keen to study. I'll always remember her striving for knowledge and enlightenment. It was immense.
In 1917, the average Soviet citizen couldn't read the word space in his own language. They went from that to actually being in space, and that is nothing short of incredible. The number one socioeconomic problem of the capitalist world is unemployment, the reserve army of laborers. But in the USSR, employment was guaranteed. There was no unemployment. You had no fear of losing your job. Absolutely no economic anxieties. Education was free as well. There was no fear of student loans or tuition. There was no fear of being unable to afford medicine or proper health care. Hewlett-Johnson toured the USSR, and he said that this lack of fear was one of the first things that strikes out at you. He said, "Fear haunts workers in the capitalist land. Fear of dismissal. Fear that 1,000 workless men stand outside the gate eager to get his job, breaks the spirit of a man and breeds servility. Fear of unemployment. Fear of slump, fear of trade depression, fear of sickness, fear of an impoverished old age lie with crushing weight on the mind of the worker. A few weeks' wages only lies between him and disaster. He lacks reserves. Nothing strikes the visitor to the Soviet Union more forcibly than the absence of fear. No fear for maintenance at the birth of a child cripples the Soviet parents. No fear of the doctor's fees, school fees, or university fees. No fear of underwork, no fear of overwork, no fear of wage reduction in a land where none are unemployed. So long as work is needed, work is free to all. Workers are in demand in the Soviet Union, and wages rise. There was absolutely nothing stopping someone from rising to any sort of top position within a nation. All the resources were there. Education and employment was guaranteed, unlike within capitalism. Your income doesn't depend on market forces and your current income level. And contrary to popular belief, not everyone was paid literally the same wage in the Soviet Union. Even Karl Marx talked about within the first phases of a socialist society, people are still paid according to their work. And within the USSR, you did have this type of freedom to rise above the economic situation which you were born at. Even Western historians admit this, such as Sheila Fitzpatrick. It was actually controversial for her to write about the social mobility in the Soviet Union because of political reasons.
But the notion of upward social mobility in the Soviet Union, all the more as a cause of support for the regime, was turned out, to my surprise, to be extremely controversial in the US.
I don't understand, why would that be controversial? I mean,
you might well ask. I mean, I was always saying, people would say to me, don't use the word social mobility. I said, what do you mean don't use these words? What other way am I going to describe it? But it seemed to be that the sense was that first of all, my argument suggested that there were some people who actually supported. There were some reasons to support the Soviet Union, some groups that felt gratitude or identification, so it wasn't just fear. That was a part of it. But the other part, I think, was that there seemed to be a sense that of course, the social scientists would all deny this, but that upward social mobility was a particular American invention associated with American democracy. And to suggest that anybody else had it was to imply to lessen that particular American achievement.
There was also a prevalence of workers' rights, which historian Robert Thurston writes. Such bounds allowed a great deal that was deeply significant to workers, including some aspects of production norms, pay rates and classifications, safety on the job, housing, and treatment by managers. This occurred at a time when American workers, in particular, were struggling for basic union recognition, which even when one did not provide much formal influence at the workplace. And of course I have a whole video dedicated to the democratic rights of workers within the USSR. Now, not to mention the strivings within social equality, the massive minority and women rights within the Soviet Union and other socialist nations. Everyone was seen as an equal. Any minority or woman enjoyed the full right as everyone else.
For the first time as I stepped on Soviet soil, I felt myself a full human being. A full human being. So it is unthinkable to me today that colored peoples in any part of the world would ever join a war or a tax upon the Soviet Union.
To produce engineers and technicians for the new society, training was expanded. And the communists said women should have equality with men, with equal pay. Ella Shistya was one of a new generation of women.
Когда Ленин сказал, стране нужна электрификация, а коммунизм это советская...
When Lenin said that communism is Soviet power plus electrification, I decided that I should become an electrical engineer, that was my holy duty. And I didn't want to just draw up plans, I wanted to build an electric power station. That was my mission, and I achieved it.
Она давала мне...
The revolution gave me the right to feel equal to any man. It gave me the right to work, to study what I wanted to study.
Она давала мне право трудиться, учиться так, как я хочу.
Yodorova was held up as an example to others.
And there also comes this nonsense about innovation. There was no innovation in the Soviet Union. That's plainly absurd. There are numerous scientific, technological, and militaristic innovations. Sputnik, laser eye surgery, LEDs, nuclear icebreakers, and on and on and on. And one of the most amazing things for me is the creation of the first mobile phone from Leonid Kupryanovich, which kind of goes against that argument from the iPhone that you critique capitalism while using something upheld by capitalism. Well, the first mobile phone was created under socialism. And even many innovations today and in the past are trying to copy this Soviet-style central planning. For example, the USA heavily used central planning in their space race, which is completely ironic. They're trying to prove the superiority of capitalism by trying to copy Soviet central planning. And even today, most innovations don't even come out of the private sector, but from the public sector. A study by Brock and Keller found that 77 out of R&D's magazine's top 88 innovations had been fully funded by the US government, and research from the economist Mariana Mazzucato found that algorithms that underpinned Google's success were funded by the public sector. The technology in Apple iPhone was invested in the public sector. In both the US and Britain, it was the state, not Big Pharma, that funded groundbreaking new molecular entity drugs, with the private sector then developing slight variations. And in Finland, it was the public sector that funded the early development of Nokia and made a return on its investment. And when it comes to the healthcare of the USSR, the healthcare had more doctors per person than the US and the UK, as well as more doctors' beds. And you could see the increase of life expectancy. The life expectancy never fell dramatically, except after the Soviet Union. And that brings us to post-Soviet Union, which is an interesting thing. We have a before and after on a socialist economy. One decade you had socialism, although after Stalin it became heavily bureaucratized with market elements. It was still a type of bureaucratized socialism. Albert Szymanski called it something such as intelligentsia socialism, but it still wasn't fully, totally, outright capitalist. It didn't have the counter-revolution yet. From a scientific standpoint, this is as good as an experiment as we're going to get. We have one set of conditions present in a nation, and then we take away that set of conditions and look at the effects. So the idea that the Soviet Union collapsed, it puts up this idea that the economy was just so terrible, and it was just decaying so much that it just couldn't handle it anymore, and it just fell apart in the hands of the Communist Party. This shows how language is used to manipulate something. The economy became quote-unquote stagnant. It was relatively stagnant. It still grew steadily, but not as fast because it became more developed, along with a whole bunch of complex reasons, such as a forced arms race, bureaucracy, and many other factors. But none of these were actually intrinsic to the socialist system. There were solid plans under Andropov to fix such problems. But instead we got Gorbachev, since Andropov died, and he decided to allow small to medium-sized businesses in the country. And this was the state of the economy, late Soviet Union. It wasn't when it was at its peak socialist, when it had its full central planning, but when it actually started to allow markets within its nation. What actually happened was the Soviet Union was dissolved by 3 men against majority vote. They held a referendum, and 75% of the people voted to keep the Soviet Union. But in favor of so-called democracy, spearheaded by Boris Yeltsin, he overthrew the Communist Party. He led 3 various military coups, eventually outlawed the Communist Party, and dissolved the Soviet Union, and then planned to denationalize industry, to put things back into private hands, to turn the nation into a capitalist paradise. That's far from the idea that it just collapsed in itself because the economy was terrible. After all, if the Soviet Union had an economic collapse, why didn't the Russian Federation collapse? Why didn't everything throughout Eastern Europe collapse? Because the GDPs were absolutely horrible after the Soviet Union. There's this huge dip after the Soviet Union due to Yeltsin's shock therapy. And economist Paul Cockshott writes about the economic effects of post-Soviet Union. The restoration of the market mechanism in Russia was a vast, controlled experiment. Nation, national character, and culture, national resources, and productive potential remained the same. Only the economic mechanism changed. If Western economists were right, then we should have expected economic growth and living standards to have leapt forward after the Yeltsin shock therapy. Instead, the country became an economic basket case. Industrial production collapsed, technically advanced industries atrophied, and living standards fell so much that the death rate shot up by over a third, leading to some 7.7 million extra deaths. If you were old, if you were a farmer, if you were a manual worker, the market was a great deal worse than even the relatively stagnant Soviet economy of Brezhnev. The recovery under Putin, such as it was, came almost entirely as a side effect of rising world oil prices, the very process that had operated under Brezhnev. And Paul Cockshott actually has a YouTube now, and he describes the factors for the collapse of the Soviet Union in one of his videos. But basically what happened was that Putin took increasingly control over the oil industry during the oil boom, which led to the recovery of the Russian economy. The Brookings Institute describes Russian policy like this: Russian energy companies affecting in essence a creeping renationalization of the sector. Energy and energy companies are important tools for the state in promoting Russian foreign policy. But more importantly, what did the people themselves think about this? Unless the people themselves supported it and felt like they benefited, what use is it? After all, what is a society other than its people? Well, a majority of former Soviet citizens feel that life was better under socialism. 60% of Russians want the Soviet Union back. A majority prefer planning rather than private capitalism. And 75% of people actually voted to keep the Soviet Union in 1991. The same is true for former Soviet Asia, Romania, East Germany, and other parts of this Eastern Bloc Time and time again, polls show that those who lived under both systems prefer the Soviet system. And the personal stories of these people are very telling. I've already talked about East Germany and the East German experiences in a previous video. Around 2008, 52% of East Germans believe that the free market economy is unsuitable. And 43% said they wanted socialism rather than capitalism. And this study also has some quite telling quotes. Thomas Pivot, who was a 46-year-old IT worker from East Berlin, said, "We read about the horrors of capitalism in school. They really got that right. Karl Marx was spot on. I had a pretty good life before the wall fell. No one was worried about money because money didn't really matter. You had a job even if you didn't want one. The communist idea wasn't all that bad." Another one, Hermann Heibel, who's a 76-year-old retired blacksmith, stated, "I thought communism was shit, but capitalism is even worse. The free market is brutal. The capitalist wants to squeeze out more, more, more." Monica Weber, a 46-year-old city clerk, stated, "I don't think capitalism is the right system for us. The distribution of wealth is unfair. We're seeing that now. The little people like me are going to have to pay for this financial mess with higher taxes because of greedy bankers." Ralph Wolf believed life would be better under capitalism, but he stated it took just a few weeks to realize what the free market economy was all about. It's rampant materialism and exploitation. Human beings get lost. We didn't have the material comforts, but communism still had a lot going for it. Another study, roughly a year later, also found that a majority of Eastern Germans feel that life was actually better under socialism. Furthermore, 80% of Bulgarians believe they are worse off now. Mimi Vitkova, former health minister of Bulgaria, said, "We were never a rich country, but when we had socialism, our children were healthy and well fed. They all got immunized, retired people and the disabled were provided for, and got free medicine. Our hospitals were free. Today, if a person has no money, they have no right to be cured, and most people have no money. Our economy was ruined." An interview by the Globe and Mail in Poland observed a family searching for scrap metal to sell. The father stated, "There was better life in communism. I was working 25 years for the same company, and now I can't find a job, any job. They only want young and skilled workers." Gustav Molinar from Hungary states, "The reality is that when foreign firms come here, they're only interested in hiring people under 30. It means half the population is out of the game." Masiej Gwendola heads a group in Poland, which are disillusioned with the unfulfilled promises of capitalism. They promised us a world of consumption, stability, and freedom. Instead, we got an entire generation of Poles who emigrated to go wash dishes. The New York Times interviewed 2 former Soviet citizens in 2004. "Life was better under the communists," said Alexander, 49, who said he had worked here since he was 19. Like the others, he asked that his last name not be used for fear of reprisal from the company. "These stores are full of things," he recalled, "but they're very expensive, and labor isn't worth a thing." Victor, on the other hand, said that the main problem was the long-gone stability of an earlier era of affordable healthcare, free higher education and housing, and the promise of a comfortable retirement, things now beyond his reach. Most of all, he wants his children to live elsewhere, but even that dream is faint. "I don't really believe that's possible," Victor said. In former parts of Soviet Asia, Anvar from Uzbekistan believes, "We lost a lot with the disappearance of the Soviet Union that left us in a pitiful situation. I am a teacher, and I can tell you that the impact of changes really weigh on public service professions. Today, we draw minimum wages that are not even sufficient to provide for the basic needs of the home. My salary is an equivalent to a sum of $300 a month, which I spend right away for 2 weeks of food for the family. Fortunately, my wife works too, and her wages allow us to pay for the remaining 2 weeks of the month. She is a professor of French, but she gave up her job just because of the low salary of the university. It's been about 10 years that she has worked as a housekeeper for a family of French expatriates in Tashkent. Her salary is $450 a month. We have a daughter. She is 15 years old. Previously, during the Soviet era, life was quite different. We had decent wages that allowed us to live reasonably. We could buy goods, a car, pay for cultural activities and sports, a dacha, a trip to another country of the USSR, etc. Sometimes, where there were premiums and less spending, you could even save our salaries. While today we can only buy food and pay for gas and electricity. In the morning, you get up and you wonder how to make money. Sasha, a 68-year-old Russian man living in Kyrgyzstan, tells the author in A Trembling Voice about the Soviet era that he knew in both Russia and Kyrgyzstan. You do not know the time. Ask your parents, they will tell you. It was beautiful. Everything was in order, with a house, a job, a living wage. Care was free. On weekends we went to movies, park, or in the mountains in summer. Life was good. Today you think only how to get money. Fortunately, we have our pensions and shelter. Otherwise, I do not know how you would survive. When I was young, I never thought I would live the last years of my life in Bishkek in this situation. I thought one day I would finally go back to Russia, where, moreover, there was no one in my family. I remember my youth spent there. I had pictures of my friends from school when I was a pioneer in the Komsomol. I carried the Soviet flag. So is this freedom? Well, yes, it is, in the sense that the former East German defense minister, Heinz Kessler, has stated. Millions of people in Eastern Europe are now free from employment, free from safe streets, free from healthcare, free from social security.
It's a good thing, Anna says. We need to live the same way we did under Stalin. Outlawing the parliament was the last straw for stalwart communists. Their beloved Soviet Union has fallen apart. Living standards have plummeted. And once Yeltsin banned the parliament, he began signing a raft of decrees trying to turn Russia into a capitalist paradise.
I want my country back. I want great Russia be united.
I'll be here all the time until we win, says this man. I'm doing this for my children, says this woman. Better to stand here for a couple of weeks than live for decades on my knees.
Показывает, что сегодня рейтинг Сталина самый высокий за последние годы. Он не был тираном, он не был диктатором. Он был величайшим руководителем нашего государства. Он возвысил ее до невероятных высот.
Он сам не воровал и другим не давал. Поэтому, чтобы вернуть имя Сталина, я бы села даже на...
If we are to believe that society is about providing for its people, to provide for the greatest good, to satisfy people's needs, then we are to accept that socialism did work. There are still nations and people within them which strive to be like the Soviet Union, to reach what the Soviet Union had, and can we fault them? Now this is only a case of socialism within the former Soviet Union, which is significant but not the only example. A study published on PubMed, a very, very reputable, trustworthy medical journal, compared socialist and capitalist nations of equal economic development, using World Bank data which covers 97% of the world population. They found that in 28 of 30 comparisons between countries at similar levels of economic development, socialist countries showed more favorable physical quality of life outcome, physical quality of life variables being indicators of health, health services, and nutrition, and measures of education. So, does socialism work? Well, the people who lived within both systems seem to think so. Despite what anti-communist propaganda is thrown out, every single time socialism has been tried, you can see the improvement before and after the revolution. You can see the improvement when comparing it to nations of similar economic development. The only way you conclude that socialism doesn't work is to make such false comparisons with wealthy, first world capitalist nations. I'm going to end this with one of my favorite clips of Michael Peranti on this issue of before and after revolutions and his personal experience with Cuban socialism.
You could look at any existing socialist country, if you don't want to call them socialist, call them whatever you want, post-capitalist, whatever, I don't care, call them camels, window shades, doesn't matter, as long as we know the countries we're talking about. You can look at any one of those countries and you can evaluate them in several ways. One, comparing them to what they had before. And that to me is what's very compelling. That's what's so compelling about Cuba, for instance. When I was in Cuba, I was up in the Escambray, which is like the Appalachia of Cuba, very rugged mountains, the people, very poor they were. And I said to this campesino, I said, do you like Fidel? And he said, sí, with all our souls. I remember his gesture, with all our souls. I said, why? And he pointed to this clinic right up there on the hill, which we had visited. He said, look at that. He said, before the revolution, we never saw a doctor. If someone was seriously ill, it would take 20 people to carry that person. because you'd go day and night. It would take 2 days to get to the hospital. First, because it was far away, and second, because you couldn't go straight. You couldn't cross the latifundio lands. The boss would kill you, so you had to go like this. And often when we got to the hospital, the person might be dead by the time we got there. Now we have this clinic up here with a full-time doctor. And today, a doctor in Cuba, when you become a doctor, you've got to spend 2 years out in the country. That's your dedication to the people. And a dentist who comes 1 day a week. And for more serious things, we're not more than 20 minutes away from a larger hospital. That's in the Escambray. He said, that's freedom. We're freer today. We have more life. And I talked to a guy in Havana who says to me, before, all I used to see here in Havana, you call this drab and dull. We see it as a cleaner city. It's true, you got the paint is peeling off the walls, but you don't see kids begging in the streets anymore, and you don't see prostitutes. All we used to have was prostitutes. Prostitution used to be one of the biggest industries. And today, this man is going to night school. He said, I can read. I can read. Do you know what it means to be able to read? Do you know what it means to be able not to read? I remember when I gave my book to my father, I dedicated a book of mine, Power and the Powerless, to my father. I said, to my father with my love. Gave him a copy of the book. He opened it up, looked at that. He'd only gone to the 7th grade. He was a son of an immigrant, a working-class Italian. And he opens the book, and he starts looking through it, and he gets misty-eyed, very misty-eyed. And I thought it was because he was so touched that his son had dedicated a book to him. That wasn't the reason. He looks up to me and says, I can't read this, kid. I said, that's okay, Dad. Neither can the students. I mean, that's not something... I mean, don't worry about that. I wrote it for you. I mean, it's your book, and you don't have to read it. You know, it's a very complicated book, an academic book. He says, yeah, I can't read this book. And the defeat that man felt. That's what illiteracy is about. That's what the joy of literacy programs is. That's why in Nicaragua you got people walking proud now for the first time. They were animals before. They weren't allowed to read. They weren't taught to read. So you compare a country to what it came from, with all its imperfections, and those who demand instant perfection. The day after the revolution, they get up and say, are there civil liberties for the fascists? Are they going to be allowed to have their newspapers and their radio program? Are they going to be able to keep all their farms? The passion that some of our liberals feel, the day after the revolution, the passion and concern they feel for the fascists, the civil rights and civil liberties of those fascists who were dumping and destroying and murdering people before. Now the revolution has got to be perfect. It's got to be flawless. Well, that isn't my criteria. My criteria is what happens to those people who couldn't read. What happens to those babies that couldn't eat, that died of hunger? And that's why I support revolution. The revolution that feeds the children gets my support. Not blindly, not unqualifiedly.